There are people with kindness, intelligence, good intentions, and yet sometimes they do things that don't reflect who they are. A message you shouldn't have sent, an argument that gets out of hand, a purchase that throws off your finances, a decision made in the heat of the moment that ends up costing you dearly. All of this has a name: impulsivity. And no, it's not just a simple, "that's how I am." Impulsivity is a problem of self-regulation. And as a psychologist, I can assure you that impulsivity is behind a lot of bad things. Addictions, mental disorders, emotional suffering, bad decisions, failures. But the good news is that there's a lot you can do about it. In fact, it's one of the common goals in many therapy cases. Stay with me in this video as we cover 3 keys to managing impulsivity, boosting self-control, and improving decision-making. But when we talk about impulsivity, we're not just referring to making decisions too quickly, arguing, or suddenly blowing up. Impulsivity is a personality trait that, if we don't work on it, can harm us in practically every area of our lives. In romance, in family, in health, in habits, career, life decisions, and of course in our financial health. If nowadays it's already difficult for us to have a solid financial structure, impulsivity makes things even more complicated when we don't have this personality trait under control. Let's start by really understanding what impulsivity is. This is key for you to understand the 3 main points through which we're going to address this problem. First of all, impulsivity is not spontaneity. You can act genuinely and freely, but be aware of what you're doing and not harm yourself or others. It's also not sensitivity or emotional intensity. You can feel deeply and still reflect, regulate yourself, and have self-control. It's also not a lack of empathy or not having values. You can have ethics, morals, desires, goals, consideration for others, but in that state of impulsivity, you might not have access to all of that. So when the emotional activation goes down, you do have access to all that, and then guilt and regret appear. With all this in mind, let's break down what impulsivity is so we can figure out how to address it. First, impulsivity is a tendency to act quickly and automatically in response to an internal or external stimulus. What do we mean by internal stimulus? An external stimulus can be something that happens to you, a comment someone makes, a look, something that triggers a particular feeling, an object of desire. It can be a thought, an emotion, a memory, a physiological sensation. Just with this, you are already learning a lot about impulsivity because you are seeing that your impulses are not always triggered by something happening in real life. Many times they come from within you, even without you realizing it. In fact, one of the most interesting steps in therapy, it's when the person learns to identify that their actions can't always be explained by what someone else has done or what happened to them that day. But that many times understanding our behavior comes from detecting what has gone through our mind, our body, our heart. When you ask many people, "Hey, why did you feel bad? What caused your slump?" They'll answer, "I don't know. Nothing happened to me. It was just an unusual day. I don't understand it." Well, getting used to doing this self-analysis of internal stimuli is already a big step forward in fighting impulsiveness. Now let's move on to the second part of the definition. Not stopping long enough to evaluate consequences, consider alternatives, or regulate the emotion in that moment. In other words, impulsiveness is understood as a failure of restraint, of inhibition, a failure of self-regulation, where immediate relief takes precedence over the goal and the medium and long-term consequences. Okay, so in the first part of the definition, we've seen that first there's an element, a stimulus that can come from outside or from within. And now in this second part of the definition, we're seeing that in that space between the stimulus and what we do, something is missing. It's a very short space and there are things missing there. There's a lack of inhibition, a lack of self-regulation, a lack of being able to think about the consequences. With this, we're already seeing that the strategies to work on impulsivity will go in these 2 directions. Knowing our triggers, our Achilles heel, and working on changing that space between the trigger and the behavior. But we're still missing something. The third pillar, analyzing that impulsive behavior that comes from us. What do I usually do impulsively without thinking it through that has negative consequences for me, that makes me act in a way I don't like? And here, an important question arises. Do I generally act impulsively? Or are there certain areas of my life, certain situations, certain emotions, certain contexts, where I lose a bit of rationality, of control, and do things I don't expect or don't like? In the first case, it's probably impulsivity. sea un rasgo de tu personalidad. Both due to genetics and learning, there are people who are less likely to self-regulate, control themselves, and think about the consequences. Acting immediately and automatically is their pattern. In the second case, when you only notice impulsivity in response to certain stimuli, that's when things change. There we're talking about a history, an association, an emotional imprint, an addiction, or even something traumatic. In this case, it's a good idea to analyze deeply and carefully what might be behind those stimuli. What do they trigger in you? Why do you respond that way? For what purpose do you respond that way? For example, some people, at any sign of possible rejection, right or wrong, immediately change their mind, give up what they wanted, or try to please others. Or there are those who, after experiencing infidelity, now respond with aggression and anxiety as soon as that fear is triggered. Perfect. Now that you have an outline of how we're going to work, let's go through these 3 keys one by one, looking at different exercises that I recommend to you. First key, understanding your triggers. We're not going to talk about little kittens here, we're going to talk about prevention. You see, there are days when your break works and there are days when your break isn't as accessible. And this isn't a matter of chance, but because you are in quote-unquote risky conditions. So it's very important to know ourselves in order to prevent. For that, we're going to do 2 things. Identify your red zone situations and set protection rules for those moments. This first exercise is called red zone situations, and I want you to make a simple list. In which moments do you notice, thinking back, that it's harder for you to control yourself, regulate yourself, or think clearly? And here, really, very common things usually come up for everyone because there are certain factors and conditions that, on a physiological level, make us more prone to impulsivity and irrationality, sleeping poorly, having eaten badly, being hungry, going through days of a lot of stress, being bored, feeling empty, feeling insecure, feeling judged, feeling pressured to do something quickly, feeling threatened, feeling afraid, having drunk alcohol or used other substances, being late, or being distracted by your phone. It's called a red zone situation because in those moments your system is more reactive and your brain is going to try to quickly solve that tension, that discomfort. This brings us to the second exercise, the traffic light. Every day calmly you're going to ask yourself, am I green today? Am I amber today? Or am I red today? I've slept well, I've eaten well, I'm calm, I'm at peace, my mind feels clear, I don't feel emotionally unsettled. Today is a good day to make decisions, to talk about certain things, to react, to respond. Amber, I'm a bit tired, I'm a bit off balance, so I'm going to take a little more care of myself. I'm going to give myself more time, more compassion. I'm not going to try to put myself in situations that demand too much from me. I'm going to let others know how I'm feeling. And maybe we can find other times to discuss that topic. Red zone situation. I've slept terribly, I've been stressed and irrational for days. Am I about to get my period? Did I consume something? Did I recently have a big argument? Anything that you, through your self-awareness and self-observation, notice somehow affects how you normally are. And this is not the time to force yourself to do things, or to negotiate with yourself, or to demand from yourself, or to try to please. This is the time to quote-unquote protect yourself and others. Simply, today is not the day. And on these days when you notice that the traffic light is red, no decisions are made, you don't react to important things, and you don't give credibility or weight to thoughts that may come to you. It's not a day to have arguments, to deal with complicated issues. It's not a day to force yourself to do something important or that will put you under pressure or stress. This is, in the end, self-knowledge, prevention, and self-regulation. It's about being smart and pragmatic with your nervous system. Understanding that it's not always about willpower or self-control, that we don't always have to be okay and perfect or demanding of ourselves. Sometimes you have to listen to your body, respect it, and understand that there are days for everything. Now let's move on to the second key, increasing the space between the trigger and my impulse, my behavior. We've already seen that we can do a lot of prevention so these impulses don't get the best of us. But even so, there will be times when you'll get worked up. And that's where many people fail, because they try to do something that's very difficult. Make a good decision, behave well when you're in a state of hyperarousal. So the second key is this: don't try to beat that impulse with thoughts. Beat it with time, because impulsivity has a weak spot. When there's immediacy, urgency, the need to solve or act right now, impulsivity wins over us. But as soon as you create space between that stimulus and your behavior, that's when you can have more control. Or well, rather than having control, the impulse gets weaker. So for that, we're going to look at two very simple exercises: the delay rule and urge surfing. First exercise, the delay rule. When the urge to do something comes up, you don't do it right away. You give yourself a minimum amount of time before allowing yourself to carry out that behavior. And I want you to understand it like this. It's not that I'm forbidding myself, which paradoxically often increases the desire and the urge to do it, but rather you're going to think of it as giving yourself time to make a better choice. Because in the heat of the moment, your brain isn't looking out for your well-being or your long-term consistency. It's just seeking immediate relief, a release. So here, the exercise is to set simple time rules for yourself, depending on the type of impulse you notice you usually have. For example, if during an argument you notice you get really heated, before responding with whatever comes to your mind, you force yourself to count for 30 seconds. If you get a message, a WhatsApp, or an annoying comment, same thing. I'm going to put my phone down for 20 minutes before saying or doing whatever comes to me. If it's a purchase that I'm really tempted to make but maybe I don't need, I set myself the rule of waiting 48 hours. If it's a big decision I have to make about my life, and this uncertainty is really stressing me out, and I want to know what to do right now, I set myself the rule of waiting a week before making the decision. You create your own rules, your own timing, but you have to stick to them. In fact, just by following this rule, even if you eventually give in to that impulse, by sticking to the timing, you've already worked a lot on your impulsiveness. And it's at these moments that your mind might try to trick you, like, I need it now, I have to respond right away, I can't wait. But that's not true. That sense of urgency is actually your mind wanting to lower that state of overactivation, of dysregulation. That annoying feeling of, I have to do something right now to fix this. That is, you don't really need to respond, say what just came to your mind, make that decision, or make that purchase. What you need right now is for that activation to go down. It's important to understand this, because when 10, 20, 60 minutes go by, you realize that the impulse wasn't as real as it seemed, but rather a physiological, emotional urgency. That brings us to the second exercise, urge surfing. And why do we say surfing? Because that feeling of urgency, that physiological activation, is like a wave. You start to notice it, you perceive it, and you see how its intensity increases until it reaches a peak. The problem is that many times, as we see and perceive that this physiological activation, this urge, this tension is increasing, we think it's going to keep growing indefinitely. We don't keep in mind that this reaches a peak and then starts to go down naturally. So, what many people do is make decisions or act when they're here instead of waiting to get here. So, this urgency, this tension that makes us impulsive, we have to see it as a wave. It comes, rises, reaches a peak, and then goes down. And like I said, the problem is that many times we act at the peak. We try to control the feeling too much, so we end up prolonging this peak for too long. Because we believe that if we don't do something, we're going to stay there at that peak, in that uncomfortable or intense feeling. Which is paradoxical, because doing things at that peak actually makes the situation worse. When you're at that peak, at the top of the wave, you think, I need to do something, I can't stay like this, I don't want to be like this. Whether you act or not, a wave, no matter how high, always comes down. Who has had a panic attack? You must have noticed this. It feels like it keeps rising, and you'll always feel this way, but it eventually comes down. Knowing the fall follows the rise brings relief and helps regulate things. So this exercise is incredibly simple. Allow yourself to feel that urge without acting on it. First, what you need to do is name it, identify it. This is a feeling of urgency, it's something subjective, it's not a real need, it's not a problem, it's not an order. I'm not always going to feel this way. I'm catching a wave, I'm going up with it, I'm surfing it, and soon I'm going to come down. Then I invite you to locate that urgency, that tension, that activation in your body. Where do you feel it? In your chest, in your stomach, in your throat, in your hands? Now breathe slowly 10 times. And the goal here is not to completely relax, it's not to eliminate that sensation, it's to bring that activation down a little. Now we wait 2 minutes without doing that behavior, just to observe what's happening in your body and notice how little by little that wave starts to go down. And this is where you train that self-control, because it's not about being cold, ignoring or repressing your emotions or disconnecting yourself. It's about being able to feel, to observe it, to listen to it, but without being dragged by it. Just like the surfer catches the wave with the board and doesn't let themselves be carried away by the current. When you've already managed not to act impulsively, this is when the third key comes in, and for me, it's the most important one: opposition. Powerful. Since it's the one that has the greatest impact in the long term, on the consequences in your life, in your relationships, in your self-concept, in your self-esteem. So, third key: analyze what happened, understand it, and redesign that pattern for future situations. When we talk about impulsivity, most people think, I just don't have self-control. But the key isn't to start with that control, as we've seen, but rather to understand what triggers you. Because impulsivity isn't something that just pops up, that appears out of nowhere. Instead, it's part of a chain of events. And when you're able to detect that chain, how it unfolds, that impulsive behavior no longer catches you by surprise. And for that, we're going to talk about the ABCCCDE exercise. I'll explain it to you now. If you follow my content a lot, it's likely that you've heard me talk about this exercise before. Because it's actually a very powerful tool to better manage impulsivity, for self-awareness, to understand our emotional patterns and our relationship patterns. For this exercise, I want you to think about some impulsive behavior you've had recently that you would like to change, an impulsive behavior you tend to have, and gradually apply each of the steps I'm going to describe to you. We start with A, the activating event. A is that internal or external stimulus we talked about a little while ago. It's what happened before that impulsive behavior, and here you have to be very specific. It's not enough to just say, I felt like it. A criticism, a comment, an overwhelming task, a temptation, accumulated fatigue, a thought, a memory, a bodily sensation. It's that trigger, that initial click that sets off the whole chain of impulsive events. Now that you have that activating event, that internal or external stimulus that triggered everything, let's move on to B. B comes from the English word belief, but I don't focus so much on the cognitive aspect of how you interpreted what happened, but rather on what that event activates in you, what it stirs up. It could be an emotion, a bodily sensation, it could be a thought, it could be an interpretation, it could be an association, right? Something that this reminds me of, or a conclusion I jump to, that B is the space between A, the activating event, the stimulus, and your impulsive behavior. What happens in that moment, in that time, in that space between what happens and what you do? This is where self-observation takes place. It could be the feeling that you are being judged. It could be the feeling of frustration. It could be a thought like, I'm a mess. It could be deep anger. It could be anxiety. It could be remembering a situation from the past where you felt the same way. It might be an interpretation of what happened, of what just happened, a conclusion you jump to, a judgment you make. This B, this space, is what causes C. Because if you feel a lot of anger, maybe that's when you end up breaking something. If you interpret it as if you're being judged, maybe that's when you end up breaking something. So here comes C, the behavior, the impulse, the visible part, the thing you later regret. Sending a message, canceling plans, escaping into social media, arguing, falling back into a habit or an addiction. And here comes something that's really key. This C, this impulsive behavior, almost always serves an immediate relief function. Feeling like you're regaining control, reducing internal tension, avoiding an emotion, seeking a reward, some relief. But it's a trap, because even though it gives us a sense of well-being in the short term, it takes away discomfort. In the medium and long term, it brings us negative consequences. This would be the C, the consequence of the behavior. An impulsive behavior can have practical consequences in your life. For example, more chaos, more delays, wasted time, stress, poor organization. It can have consequences in your relationships, in your environment. That people lose trust in you, that there is a conflict, that you get isolated, that they see you as someone unpredictable. But also, and this is what interests me the most, it has a consequence on your self-concept, on your self-esteem. I'm not capable. I'm a mess. I can't have relationships. I'm weak. Things will always go wrong for me in life. All our behaviors have an impact on our self-image because we are always observing ourselves. And here, very often, a very typical cycle forms that is behind, for example, many addictions. I feel that urge, that activation, that wave. I seek immediate relief, but then it has a negative effect on my life. Then I feel more tension, more discomfort, I need more relief, and I fall back into that urge again. And so the issue keeps getting more complicated and worse. And here comes another thing that's really key. To reflect in the moment when you feel that wave, that activation. Reflecting on what consequence your behavior might have is already very therapeutic. It really helps with impulsivity. Stopping yourself in that moment and not thinking about the wave or the urgency, but instead about where that behavior could lead you, will already greatly reduce impulsivity. But now let's move on to change. To D, D stands for debating or discussing, which is basically about questioning, changing, modifying, or improving that B. That thing that appears, that emerges in you between the activating event, that stimulus, and your behavior. If you tend to take a friend arriving late as if they're undervaluing you, and that then leads to impulsive behaviors and conflicts. So in D, you're going to try to offer other ways of understanding the situation or approaching it or feeling it so that it doesn't lead you to the same impulsive behavior. Of course, this isn't about thinking positively or denying reality. It's about finding ways to face and manage what happens to us in a more adaptive way, adjusted to reality and to what is useful, practical, and beneficial. The goal of that D is to reflect, question, debate. D for debate, to analyze what appears between that stimulus and my action. To understand that sadness that appears, where it comes from. Why does that stimulus cause me anxiety or make me angry? Why do I interpret it that way? Whether that's rational and grounded in reality. Whether there are other possible explanations or ways of looking at it. D is the moment when you take the wheel of your impulses. You question your automatic patterns to stop acting on autopilot. And you explore other ways of taking things, of reacting, and of proceeding. This would then take us to the last letter, finally E, which is about making a choice or running an experiment. E is a choice. It's an experiment because you give yourself the opportunity to break free from that automatic pattern, that impulse, that chain you always fall into. It's about thinking, okay, now that I understand where that sadness comes from, why I interpret it that way, why I act that way, what can I do differently the next time a similar trigger appears? What can I do differently the next time my partner comes home and doesn't approach me affectionately? E has two parts. The first is how I'm going to interpret that trigger the next time it appears. That is, what am I going to do with that B? Instead of interpreting that my partner comes home and doesn't talk to me because he doesn't love me and because he's selfish, I'm going to understand that it's his way of saving energy, that he needs to come home, relax a little, and then we can be together. And the second part is what other actions am I going to take so I don't have the same consequences? That is, what other C am I going to try out? So instead of me also putting on a long face and ignoring him to quote-unquote punish him, I'm going to understand that everyone has their own way of regulating their emotions or their physiological needs. I'm going to keep myself busy with something, and when my partner is more relaxed and calm, I'll approach them. Now that you understand what impulsivity is, how it works, how to address it, and you have a few exercises to apply, I want to point out that impulsivity is something you train. It's not something that changes overnight. It takes constant training. Being impulsive is something that is learned, that is reinforced, and it's also something that can be unlearned and weakened. Yes, it's a trait that is strongly influenced by genetics, but it can always be improved a lot. And you have to understand that if your brain has been trained for years to seek immediate relief or release, it's normal that at first it will be hard for you to implement all of this. But believe me, as you start implementing this with small things, you'll gradually get your mind used to it. To stop, to pause, to reflect, to think about the consequences, it will get easier and more manageable until you can eventually apply it in your most challenging areas. That is, if you're starting from scratch, I recommend that you begin with areas that are easier for you, where you have less emotional arousal. And little by little, you can start applying it to those areas that affect you more, that have some kind of impact on your life story, that have some traumatic component. Don't expect to apply all of this to those scenarios that feel most irrational and visceral to you and get immediate results. I'm going to leave you 2 videos below that I think can really help you continue with this work, understand it better, and apply it. One about how to improve willpower and another about how to stop procrastinating. Bye.